Hello, everyone. My name is Grant Parker, and I'd like to welcome you to this, our spring term global dialogue, in what truly is a spring day here in California. I'm the interim director of Stanford Global Studies, and I teach in both the departments of African and African American Studies and in the Department of Classics. On behalf of Stanford Global Studies, I would like to recognize that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land is of great importance to the Ohlone people and has been since time immemorial. In keeping with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. Stanford Global Studies is an umbrella organization comprising 14 campus units, some of which promote area studies, whereas others are transnational in their focus. In this global dialogues series, we emphasize topics that bring together different regions and topics covered by our centers. Earlier sessions this year considered monuments and commemorations in the autumn and indigenous data sovereignty in the winter term. Today's topic is shadows of slavery. We chose this topic because though the global history of enslavement is by now well established, there is much opportunity and indeed need to advance comparative approaches. In the United States, the Atlantic world so predominates historical and heritage discourse that, for example, the Mediterranean or Indian Ocean worlds are sometimes denied attention or even their comparative potential. The aim of our event today, or this evening, is to consider the longue durée of enslavement as seen from today, with some emphasis on post-abolition periods. What happens after the end of formal slavery? To what degree do social conditions remain the same under new legal dispensations? How might we make sense of post-abolition heritage, given that in some communities the memory of enslavement is celebrated and in others taboo? How might the heritage of enslavement be conveyed to various publics? Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Robin Chapdelaine, Associate Director of Stanford's Center for African Studies. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. It is a delight to have you all joining us via Zoom for this event. We thank you for taking the time. I'd like to just say that this discussion is so important. Slavery as a site of investigation covers a variety of geographical spaces, obviously a variety of different eras. And as Grant mentioned, the ability to compare and contrast different experiences is really what's important in terms of understanding across the board what are some of the mainstays of various forms of slavery. And this is something that each of our speakers will cover today, thinking about the importance of defining and understanding slavery across time and space. So it is our pleasure to introduce to you our three speakers. Dr. Laura J. Mitchell from the University of Irvine, Dr. Vijay Tilak, who is a historian of Mauritius, and then also Kate McHannon, who is a historian of global slavery and Smithsonian National Museum of African and African American History and Culture. So I would like to, at this point, give a more complete introduction of Laura Mitchell, who teaches African and World History at UC Irvine, where she seeks to make sense of the early modern societies using the tools of our digital age and to make history accessible to diverse audiences from K through 12 students to museum goers and devotees of the History Channel. Her published work explores the colonial history of South Africa and contours of world history as both a teaching subject and research enterprise. Her first book was a Born Digital project supported by the NEH, the ACLS, and the AHA's Gutenberg E-Prize. So we welcome Dr. Laura.
Thank you, Robin, for that introduction, and thank you, Grant, for including me in this conversation. I'm really honored to be part of this larger dialogue. So I'm speaking to you and others today from Irvine, which is the ancestral land of Hashamen and Tongva peoples. I think the land acknowledgement is particularly important given the history of displacement and domination that I'm going to talk about today. We daily confront the shadows and afterlives of conquest and of freedom struggles. And I realized I didn't share my screen. Hold on. So there we go. It's on my screen. If it's not on someone else's screen, someone please wave me down. I'm going to talk about shadows of slavery in South Africa. As Grant mentioned, in North America, the shape of chattel slavery in the Atlantic is the generic or baseline for understanding slave societies. Those of us who are Africanists or Indian Oceanists are aware of other experiences, including pawning, debt peonage, and enslavement that was neither lifetime nor intergenerational. The history of slavery in South Africa is then both familiar and disruptive to those of us who are steeped in a North American perspective. Chattel slavery existed in South Africa for 180 years. In that period, there were two revolts, one in 1808 and one in 1825. There were many, many other examples of resistance, but only two revolts. I'm currently writing a book about the 1825 revolt. Slave revolts are kind of sexy, but that's not the topic I want to talk about today. In order to understand this revolt better, I wanted to get a better handle on the social, spatial, and physical geography of the Coa-Bockelveld region where the revolt took place. So that's the focus of my talk today. I'm going to quickly introduce the Dutch East India Company, which I'll call by the initials that come from its Dutch name, the VOC. The VOC settlement at the Cape of Good Hope was not established as a settler outpost or as a trading entrepot. The VOC officials wanted to create a reliable refreshment station. The company had been started in 1602. By 1619, they had established an eastern headquarters in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. And by 1652, they were trying to find alternatives to the 6-month slog that was a one-way sail from Amsterdam to Batavia and Batavia back to Amsterdam. So what they wanted was a refreshment station, not a full-blown colony. VOC officials made a specific decision not to enslave or to further antagonize the indigenous Khoisan people at the Cape. They needed the Khoisan as trading partners for cattle and sheep. So they imported laborers from across the Indian Ocean. And here I'm going to make a pretty baldly racialized claim that white colonists of European origin enslaved people of Asian origin on the African continent, intentionally not enslaving indigenous Africans. I want to trouble the notion that for early modern European empires, slaves equaled Africans and Africans equal slaves. Two more dates to think about: 1526, the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade; 1621, the establishment of the Dutch West India Company. So VOC officials were well aware of Atlantic models of enslavement when they started thinking about slavery at the Cape in 1657. They chose to do something else. So another claim here: transoceanic systems of slavery were intertwined with race making, right? But there wasn't just one way that this happened. So now back to slavery in South Africa, where again, Africans did not equal slaves, and slaves were not necessarily Africans. So from these pictures, I ask you to notice the obvious Asian markers of material culture in the 19th century drawings I just dropped into the slide. I also want to talk briefly about toponyms. Dutch East India Company officials kept track of the slaves that they imported by assigning them surnames that reflected their putative places of origin. So you can see from the list on the screen, there was a diverse range of places of origin for slaves that came to the Cape of Good Hope. The first slaves that were brought to the Cape were for the use of the company, the VOC. The soldiers and sailors that were released from their contracts to work as yeoman farmers, growing crops for the company's use, soon asked to buy slaves too. So we have two basic categories of slaves, the company slaves and the settler slaves. I want to complicate the settler slaves even further to notice that there were slaves in urban households and businesses, slaves on wealthy wine and wheat farms. There were slaves on prosperous frontier farms that were really more livestock ranches than agricultural enterprises, and slaves on even poor farms in the frontier. The company, which for the majority of the 18th century owned the majority, sorry, I'll say that again. The company, for most of the 18th century, owned the majority of slaves at the Cape. Even though slaves outnumbered settlers for a time in the early 18th century, the preponderance of company slaves meant that individual farmers or the few shopkeepers in Cape Town held small numbers of slaves. So slave owners did not constitute a colonial elite. There were some big land holdings outside of Cape Town with large enslaved workforce, but this was not on the scope of plantation slavery in the Americas. A slave society is a delicate organism. Now here I want to put my world history hat on and make some broad generalizations. Forcing enslaved people to work requires violence or the threat of it. People being coerced resent it. And those who maintain control through violence and coercion spend a significant portion of their thinking time worried about reprisals. When slaves outnumber the rest of society, whether or not all the unenslaved people actually owned slaves, the ruling classes and the ostensibly free people worry a lot about staying in control. So about half the households in historical Cape Town or the Western Cape held slaves. And a quick shot here at population numbers, that slaves by the end of the 18th century, sorry, were still more than half the population. That began to diminish in the 19th century. That doesn't mean by the 19th century that slave owners really felt comfortable in their skins or in their beds at night. Now I want to talk about the geography of the Western Cape and introduce you to the region called the Coahuila Belt, where the 1825 rebellion took place. I'm doing this because, in my view, geography matters. The warm Bokkeveld and then the Coahuila, warm and cold antelope areas, were two distinct climate zones. They were separate administrative districts headed by an appointed Veldkornet in the 1820s. To get you oriented spatially, from Cape Town, we're going to head, here we are on the screen, about 90 kilometers northeast to Ceres. There's a formidable mountain range to cross. Enslaved people arriving at the port in Cape Town and then sold into the interior would have seen the Witzenberg Mountains looming from across the Boeland as they walked or traveled in an ox wagon. Once they reached present-day Ceres, which wasn't yet a town, they'd have seen a pleasant valley, the warm Bokkeveld, and they'd have kept going up the Hedo escarpment into the Coahuila. That's the area you can see on the screen. The settler farms of the Coahuila. This is a pretty complicated map. On the places on the right are the places I have just introduced you to, and then a new place, the Hodenbeck Farm, which was the site of the epicenter of the 1825 rebellion. There's two conclusions I want you to draw from this map. One, the outline of farms, which began to take place in the from 1818, shows a connected space of settler encroachment into the Cedarburg. And then we see some open areas which were just too uninhabitable or inhospitable for settlers to bother claiming farms there. So we see on this map the extent of the Coahuila district and the web of colonial land claims that anchored human connections in an unyielding landscape. What did slavery look like here? I'm going to start with the population. And here, this information is taken from the 1824 census. Notice the extent to which slaves and Khoisan outnumbered colonists. There are also some interesting age and gender differences to notice. I'm not going to dive into that today, except to note that I don't find it surprising that the enslaved community wasn't having children at the same rate as the population. According to the census, there were 647 people in the district, distributed across 26 named farms. There was a lot more livestock in the district, which, like bonded labor, was unevenly divided among settler households. This last table lets you compare the number of Khoisan indentured laborers to slaves registered on each of the 33 farms or households in the Bokkenfeld that reported controlling subordinated labor. There were 62 entries in the Opgave, right? So that means 29 adults registered no subordinated laborers. Most masters reported more Khoisan than enslaved laborers, which is typical across the colony. So these are the two outliers in the district, the households that had 16 and 22 slaves, very much on the high end of slave owning. So what happened in the rebellion? In the late night hours of February 1st, 1825, into the next morning, a group of enslaved and indentured laborers from 3 neighboring farms joined together to attack their masters, seize supplies, and, quote, make themselves free. It was quickly put down within 2 days. The accused rebels ended up standing trial, and 3 of them were executed for their role. The others were imprisoned or otherwise punished. The rebels included both enslaved and Khoisan laborers. So here we are, a slightly zoomed in map from 2 slides ago. The green lines represent historic wagon roads. Not that we need even more proof, physical proof, that these farms were tightly interconnected. The farms that I've outlined in blue are those for which I've been able to do a social reconstruction, understanding the settlers and slaves who lived on them. I want to note here that property claims with fixed boundaries, represented as straight lines, are not a natural or inherent way of dividing up the landscape. Societies make and made choices. There are holes in my research. The biggest holes are around Khoisan indentured laborers, for whom the records are much more sparse than they were for slaves. And of course, the slaves are much more sparse than the records for the settlers. And emphasize again, farms were an intentional partitioning of spatial and social geographies. So what does social geography look like for my research? Partly it looks like drilling down on one farm. So this is a fairly recent photo from the hills up above the Hodenbeck River Valley. This is the site of the Hodenbeck farm. And this, on the same claimed farm, was a tenant farm known as Sand River. The third farm that was involved in the revolt, Reach Rafir, doesn't show up on this slide. It was about 37 kilometers away. I can anchor slaves, Khoisan, and settlers in broad social, economic, and political landscapes of the Cape Colony and situate the Cape in the currents of British Empire. So if I can do that on the big picture, what am I doing drilling down into a single settler farm? And I'm doing that because the details of one farm, I argue, can help us generalize about the district as a whole. So on this one farm, we see men and women, masters and servants, landowners and tenant, local and immigrant colonial settlers, indigenous and transported bond and labor, all negotiating with each other the ways in which they lived in this place. So who lived at Hodenbeck? And I'm going to just walk through. We've got slaves, Khoisan, and settlers on the farm, which to me seems obvious, but probably isn't if you haven't been spending a lot of time thinking about this time and place. Those who were involved in the rebellion will show up on your screen in yellow. We've got the main settler household, a farmer and his wife, 6 adult enslaved people, and 17 Khoisan people. Also staying in the settler's house was the newly arrived schoolmaster, a man called Johannes Verlier, his wife and their infant baby, and a neighbor who happened to have spent the night. He was probably lending some of his labor to the farm. He lived on an adjacent farm. Right, we've got lists of Khoisan who were involved in the revolt and those who testified, but they are nowhere near the 17 Khoisan who were listed in the census. So this is part of what I'm talking about, of the ghostly apparition of Khoisan indentured labor. I know we're there, but I cannot pull up with the same level of historical detail. On the tenant farm, we have the immigrant, Johannes Dalria and his wife, another immigrant, Petrus Kempfer, working as an overseer. The slave man Dolly should have been there, but he had recently run away, along with 5 Khoisan laborers. So what does spatial geography look like? And I realize I'm coming up to time. I've got 2 more slides to get through, and then I will yield the floor. There's series to get you oriented, the Hodenbeck and Riet Riviere farms where the revolts took place. How did settlers and slaves come to live on those 2 farms? Because none of the people involved in the revolt were actually born there. But most had not moved very far, right? Willem and the slave Galant van die Kaap moved from the neighboring farm Moddervallei, where both of them had been born. His wife was the one outlier. She came from the other side of the mountains. And when she married, slaves from her parents' household also moved. We see a similar pattern up close. Barend, the farmer at Riet Riviere, had moved from the farm Lockenflay with 5 slaves he bought from his father, and his wife from another neighboring farm. When they married, she also moved with a slave from her parents. So you can see this really tightening mesh of social landscape playing out on the physical landscape. Elsie's brother, interestingly, farmed it at Long River here. I'm not going to go into that because I want to get to this slide. Koppieshoogte, which means little hill or height of the heads. On it is a monument, a Khoisan-style grave marker that's been created by community members at the site where Galant, Abel, and Isaac Thijs had their severed heads displayed on poles after their judicial execution. The initial ritual to build this cairn was a 21st century event. My visit to the site 2 years apart suggests that someone continues to care for the site. So a final slide to think about remembering, forgetting, erasing, and reviving. How do the revolts of 1808 and 1825 fit into the history of the struggle in South Africa? How can scholars and community activists address the challenges of disparate kinds and amounts of evidence from the past? Both the paper trail and the physical environment are stacked against the stories of the enslaved, stacked further against the stories of indentured Khoisan. How is current work on revolt and rebellion in slave societies reshaping Pan-African thought about resistance? And finally, how can the cross-pollination of Atlantic and Indian Ocean slave histories challenge the two-facile equation of African with slave histories? Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that talk, Laura. It was very enlightening, and I look forward to us chatting about it a little bit more at the end. Now we'd like to introduce you to Vijaya Tilak, who is a Mauritian historian and writer. Tilak studied history and lectured at the University of Mauritius, and she was the vice chairperson of the Truth and Justice Commission and also held a position of president of the Arapravasi Ghat Trust Fund. Vijaya Tilak has published a number of books, including Transition from Slavery in Zanzibar and Mauritius, A Comparative History with Abdul Sharif, Bitter Sugar, Sugar and Slavery in 19th Century Mauritius, and a select guide to sources on slavery in Mauritius and Slaves Speak Out, the testimony of slaves in the era of sugar. So we welcome Vijaya now to talk.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity of talking a little bit about this part of the world, especially the Southwest Indian Ocean islands. My first few slides are just to show the diversity, as Laura just talked about, that exists in the Southwest Indian Ocean as far as slavery is concerned, slave trade is concerned, and also the societies that have been created out of the slave trade, which are also extremely diverse. So the next slides, please, next 5 slides. So this is a map. The Indian Ocean is not the Atlantic. This is a phrase borrowed from Hubert Gébeau, French historian, and who since the 1980s campaigned for us in the Indian Ocean not to adopt models of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery onto our own countries. And I think scholars of the Indian Ocean have taken heed of what he had said and have really looked at new ways of looking at slave trade and slavery. So first, very important difference with the Atlantic is that in the Indian Ocean, it's not a triangular trade. It was more a quadrangular trade or with multiple stopovers. Ships from France, because we have the 18th century French slave trade in the Indian Ocean, left France, came not to the coast of Africa, but came to Mauritius first, then went on to India to buy textiles, China, silks, spices, etc. Came back to Mauritius, sold some of these luxury items and the textiles and so on. The boat continued onto the eastern coast of Africa or to Madagascar to trade in slaves, and then back to Mauritius, and then to Réunion Island next door, where more slaves were deposited there. So this is a key difference. Secondly, it's probably the slave trade in the Indian Ocean is probably one of the most diverse, as I'll show in the next few slides, with not only African slaves, but a large number of Malagasy slaves, and also slaves from India and Southeast Asia, and a small amount from West Africa. Next slide, please. So as Laura has mentioned earlier, in the Indian Ocean, there have been traditional forms of subjugation and domination. And this has also affected what we call colonial slavery, which came afterwards in Mauritius, Réunion, Madagascar, Zanzibar, 18th and 19th centuries. We also have from India, for example, the pariah caste, which are in Mauritius be considered as a slave caste because many Indian slaves were taken from India and brought to Mauritius from French possessions, Pondicherry, Madras, and Chandernagore. And finally, you have military slaves, those captured as prisoners, and then who were enslaved. And finally, for example, like in Zanzibar, you have what you call the Surya, domestic slavery, where women were captured and became the wives. I'm trying to go fast because I want to go on to the history of slavery. Just a few proportions and figures. So in Mauritius and Réunion, in terms of proportions, historians have estimated about 45% came from Eastern Africa, another 40% from Madagascar. Personally, I think the figure from East Africa is underrepresented. I think it's much more because we have a lot of evidence of Mozambican slaves and Tanzanian slaves, what is today Mozambique and what is today Tanzania, being brought from those regions into Madagascar and then re-exported to Mauritius, to the Mascarenes and elsewhere. So the figure for East Africa, I think, should be much larger than that. And finally, we have about 13% from India, again, the French possessions there, and a tiny proportion from West Africa. So although 2% seems very little, they were extremely valued West African slaves, especially during the Anglo-French wars when the French were in India. So the Admiral Suffren specifically asked for 3,000 slaves from West Africa, which he wanted to use as part of his navy, as soldiers, and as sailors on board his squadrons. So they are a very important part of our history. And the slide on your right simply shows the internal routes being taken. So slaves did not come from the ports, obviously. They came from inland as far as Malawi and so on, and in the interior, the Great Lakes, Tanzania, and so on. Next slide, please. Again, to show the diversity of the languages and cultures in this part of the Indian Ocean. Many African languages were spoken. Makwa and Makonde were the most common, I think, in the Mascarenes. And among the West African slaves in Mauritius, for example, in the capital city, there were 2 separate slave camps for West African slaves. We've never understood why the West African slaves were separated. One was called the Camp Bambara, and the other one, the Camp Yolof. This name still exists today in Port Louis. Malagasy also, many different ethno-linguistic groups coexisting on the islands. I have to say that slaves, by the end of slavery, abolition of slavery, they did not only speak their own language, but had adopted and learned the languages of others, including the Creole language, but also other ethno-linguistic groups within their sugar estate or their estate. Next. And also we have Indian slaves, again, Tamil, Bengali, and Urdu being spoken in the 18th century, in French 18th century Mauritius. Even though the Catholic religion was the official language religion, the French amazingly allowed Muslim slaves to open their own mosque. So this is one of the first, probably, mosque in this part of the world since the 18th century. Next slide, please. A few words about the categories of slaves that we have within the Indian Ocean. As Laura has mentioned, so I won't repeat it, but you do have private slaves belonging to individual owners. Some are very small estates, small farms with 1 or 2 slaves, but others, like the slaves, plantation slavery, you have 300, 400, 500 slaves living and working on the estate. You also have different types of private slaves. There are slaves' wives, which I mentioned earlier from Zanzibar. And in Mauritius and La Réunion, you have slaves belonging to the Catholic Church who were bought by the church and who worked within the church's premises. And then you have another category, what we call public slaves or government slaves. And this doesn't seem to exist in many other countries. Slaves bought by the government or the East India Company to work in public works. So building the infrastructure, building offices, etc., etc. And even in the only, you'll see the photo painting at the bottom on your left, we have in Mauritius the remains or the ruins of the only gunpowder making factory. Amazingly enough, despite the paranoia about slave revolt and so on, they actually took over 400 slaves to work in this gunpowder factory. So allowing slaves to make gunpowder and handle gunpowder, that was quite something quite amazing, which we still don't quite understand why this was. So a final category of slaves that existed are those, of course, maroons, those who escaped slavery and hid for many years in the forests and the caves that exist in this volcanic island. Next slide, please. So now to come more to the legacies of slavery, and I'll start with La Réunion and Mauritius. They're considered to be sister islands because they're so close. You can see from Mauritius, you can see La Réunion on a clear day. But the two could not be more different. Both were French colonies, but in one, the governor at that time, who administered both islands at the same time, decided that Mauritius would be le port and La Réunion would be le grenier. So Mauritius, with a very safe harbor and port, would be the center for trade and commerce, and La Réunion should be the warehouse or the granary. They would grow foodstuffs and feed both islands. So this resulted in a very different type of settlement. In Mauritius, Rabudone wanted gentleman farming, opening large plantation homes, almost feudal type of large plantations. In La Réunion, they encouraged small farmers to settle down. And this has, when you look at the 18th century, this has dominated the social and economic structure of both islands. And according to Daniel Northcote, one historian who wrote many years ago, he feels that this economic structure led to the very racist ideology that existed and still continues in Mauritius today, compared to La Réunion. La Réunion had a more diverse social structure, if one can say so, with a slave population, what they call petits blancs or small whites, and the big proprietors. In Mauritius, it was black and white, black slave population and white for many, many years. Next slide, please. But in the 19th century, both became large sugar plantation economies. So this phrase, nothing but freedom, as you know, is borrowed from Eric Foner and his book outlining the various outcomes in post-emancipation colonies is very, very appropriate for the Indian Ocean, Southwest Indian Ocean, Mauritius, Réunion, Zanzibar, where we have large plantation economies being established at the same time when the British are trying to abolish slavery and slave trade. So the book that I wrote, Bitter Sugar, was exactly that, to show the fate of the slaves being forced now to move from a more domestic trade and commerce economy to large plantations. So this caused enormous stress for the slaves living in Mauritius at that time. Zanzibar, we have clove plantation economy, again with the same situation, and La Réunion also. Abolition did not bring much. So for me, next slide, the situation, the post-slavery situation of slavery, for me, is as tragic as the slavery situation. The only slaves we can say who benefited in some way were the skilled slaves who continued after abolition of slavery to work in the sugar industry and were paid. But everyone else, the manual laborers, the women, the elderly, the infirm, were literally forced to leave their plantations, their home, their huts, the land they had been farming for generations, all their possessions. They were not educated, so most ex-slaves in 1835, 1839 were illiterate, homeless, and landless. So for me, this is the unfinished business of the British government, who were very proud of having abolished slavery. But what happens to the ex-slaves? So there's a mass migration after 1835-39. The slave community is completely dispersed. Many who have no employment or did not want the low wages that were being offered by their former owners decide to move into the city. At that time, it was the town of Port Louis, and fall prey to the many cholera and malaria epidemics that existed in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. So some have estimated a quarter of the ex-slave population actually dies in these epidemics. So the legacies are enormous. The Truth and Justice Commission published its report in 2011 with over 230 recommendations of how to try and overcome the legacies of slavery and to recommend some form of reparations. Next slide, please. And one of these recommendations was the setting up of a museum, a slavery museum in Mauritius in 2011. It's only in 2020 that state company was created to start this museum. We had many workshops to discuss what to put in the museum, what not to put, how to put it, etc. Finally, when it opened, it was decided that we would break the silence about slavery, because until the 1990s, people were scared of talking about slavery. When I tried to write my book after my PhD in 1990, they said, nobody is going to publish your book. And in fact, some bookshops actually refused to market the book, just to show you the silence that there was over slavery. So having a museum was very important. But whether the truth is going to be told about the history of slavery, this remains to be seen. Next slide, please. In Madagascar, The photo you see is of Chaplain Tut, a very young historian, but very promising research being done. And in Madagascar, it's slightly different because you have former traditional forms of domination. And for him, even colonial slavery or the abolition of colonial slavery did not end the situation of the descendants of slaves. So all the discriminations, the silences about slavery still remain in Madagascar today. And he shows that even today, for example, in popular culture, the word slave and devil is not used, whereas the term for nobility, Andriana, is very much present. So for him, we still have a long way to go in Madagascar of memorializing, but also talking about slavery openly. His book, next slide, please. He published a book on his research. It was not published in Madagascar, but in Mauritius, at the University of Mauritius, just to show you the silences and the difficulties of researching slavery in Madagascar. However, young people have shown the African presence in other ways, fashion, tattooing, in music, popular culture, which is very interesting. And the book, Chaplin's book, which you see the cover on the left, you may wonder why they're dressed as pirates. And this is mainly because pirates were very much part of the scene in the 17th and 18th century Madagascar. They married Malagasy women. They were on very good terms with the royalty. And they became a very important part of Malagasy society at that time. So this is a parade on the streets where people are dressed as pirates, but this is one way of talking also about slave trade and slavery. Next slide, please. So this is Zanzibar. A few years ago, we did a study comparing Zanzibar and Mauritius. As is written here, both islands have roughly the same area, same size, same population size, same histories. The only difference is that Zanzibar has a huge population of Arab origin, and also the Sharia law was in effect during British administration. The differences are that while in Mauritius today, now we are talking about slavery openly and about Dutch, French, British slavery and so on. What was interesting in Zanzibar is that the focus is on Arab slavery. And even though it was a center of the French slavery as well, there's almost no recollection, there's nothing much, even in the museums, on French and British trading. So for me, that was quite interesting, how in mainland Tanzania, people remember all the slaveries, British, French, Arab, but in Zanzibar, this is different. So I found that quite interesting to study. Next slide, please. Rodrigues. So I'm ending, I don't know about the time, but I'd like to end with the island of Rodrigues. Rodrigues is a bit like Tobago with Trinidad, the relationship between Mauritius and Rodrigues. It's a tiny island where there are no rivers. So because of the lack of water, sugar industry never existed in Rodrigues Island. There were a few slave owners, but when slavery was abolished, the owners distributed land among the Rodrigans. So up to today, Rodrigans still own the land that they had originally inherited. But we also have another group of African and Malagasy who were brought to Rodrigues, and up to now, we still have no records, no written records of where they came from and why they were brought to Rodrigues after the abolition of slavery. So this is something for historians to try and look for in the future, using perhaps family history and oral history and genealogical studies. So small-scale farming continues to exist. In Rodrigues, for me at least, they don't have the identity issues that Mauritians or Réunionnese have living in such diverse societies. The Rodrigans are very proud of their culture, their unique culture, their music, and their dance. So I would like to end with that, to show that the different economic structures, the different types of migration, and the very diverse migrations have caused very different outcomes to exist in these island societies. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that overview. Again, we look forward to talking about that more at the end of our panel. We'd like to welcome Kate now to discuss her current project and to introduce her. She is a historian of global slavery and is at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. She works as a specialist there and leads research efforts at the Center for the Study of Global Slavery. She received her BA in Art History and MA in American and New England Studies from the University of Southern Maine. She completed her PhD in History at Howard University in 2017. Her dissertation was entitled "The Transnational Dimensions of Africans and African Americans in Northern New England, 1776 to 1865," and her current research explores New England's connections to and complicity in the illegal slave trade and colonialism, 1809 to 1900. Welcome, Kate.
So much. I'm just going to share my screen. And thank you very much to the Global Studies Department for the invitation to speak today. And thank you so much to the other panelists for their important and really compelling work. I'm really looking forward to our discussion later. I'm going to talk today about how we can practically apply some of these really important histories that are often, not really well known outside of the Atlantic context. These important global, transnational, and comparative histories through one way, which is the way that we do things at the Smithsonian, through an exhibition in development currently at the National Museum of African American History and Culture with our partners. This exhibition is titled "In Slavery's Wake, Making Black Freedom in the World," and it is an international multilingual exhibition project that will illuminate, explore, and reframe the history and the legacies of slavery, colonialism, and freedom on an international scale. Collaboratively curated and constructed to travel to partner institutions in Belgium, Brazil, the United Kingdom, Senegal, and South Africa, this exhibition is a central component of a wider effort that provides an innovative model of how museums and research institutions can employ public history, and it humanizes these and catalyzes conversations that crosses international borders, connects the past to vital issues of our present, and centers histories that focus on Black lives seeking full freedom and envisioning more just and equitable futures. Our lives today around the world are marked by anti-Black racism and discrimination, health inequality, and social injustice. Wealth disparity is the greatest it has been in human history, and an environmental disaster threatens the existence of the planet and our species. In the face of these existential challenges, our world is also filled with activism and hope. Around the globe, millions of people decry this anti-Black racism. They demand systemic change and make significant efforts to foster practices of joy and community. Both the disaster and the prospect of our world today have long historical roots connected to the institutions and structures built by racial slavery and European colonialism. We can trace the twin currents of domination and freedom-making by revisiting our past through a new lens. To understand where we are and where we're going, it is important to understand how we got here. In Slavery's Wake is the National Museum of African American History and Culture's first multilingual and globally oriented exhibition, and is the first custom-built to travel with international audiences in mind. It is focused on the history of racial slavery and its wake, the legacies, afterlives, and reverberations. That history is linked closely to the histories of European colonialism. However, while racial slavery and colonialism or systems and structure of domination that attempted to dehumanize enslaved people. Central to the exhibition are the ways in which enslaved and colonized people resisted these global forces through myriads of forms of freedom-making practices. This is a story of humanity, resistance, and determination. So a bit of background and history. In slavery's wake came as the product of the years-long collaborative global curatorial project. The Global Curatorial Project, or I'll just refer to it as the GCP, is a network of scholars, curators, and educators who are committed to creating innovative forms of public history about the historical social systems of racial slavery, colonialism, and the ways they shape our contemporary world. Catalyzed by Brown's Ruth Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice and at Brown University, and the Center for the Study of Global Slavery at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the GCP has constructed global partnerships to pursue this objective. The GCP seeks to create distinctive curatorial practices, understanding that curation is not only a technique, but also an intellectual practice of judgment and care. The GCP and its projects understand that racial slavery and colonialism were social systems generated and sustained by violence, and that the structures from the past, which are present, demand new forms of representation, which reach for social justice. The GCP is a collaborative and interdisciplinary project that seeks to create distinct forms of education, public history, and curatorial practices. The GCP is defined by two major closely connected projects: a traveling exhibition in slavery's wake, and a curatorial archival collection and public engagement project called Unfinished Conversations. Together, these projects work to better understand how our lives and societies are continually shaped by the global wake of racial slavery and European colonialism. Though racial slavery and colonialism were systems that attempted to dehumanize enslaved people, both in slavery's wake and Unfinished Conversations, also ensure that we centralize and make visible throughout this history the ways in which enslaved and colonized people resisted these global forces through these various freedom-making practices. The exhibition achieves its goals in part by bringing together these institutions, an international curatorial team, collections and scholarship that are normally segregated by region, nationality, and language, and posits that we focus on this history as a shared global history. The exhibition also breaks new ground by focusing on what institutions can do to bring new stories into the world. To do so, it incorporates a novel collection of oral histories called Unfinished Conversations, creating a global archive of everyday people's stories and about the aftermaths of slavery and colonialism and their hopes for the future. Some of these voices are featured throughout the exhibition, inviting visitors to join dialogues about the past and envision freer and more just futures. The Unfinished Conversation series is central to In Slavery's Wake's exhibition development process and is the public programming and community engagement work of the GCP. The Unfinished Conversations initiative is focused on exploring the question how slavery shaped this place, both through public programs that will encourage new conversations, as well as by establishing new collections of oral histories that will explore the lived experiences and historical memories of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Unfinished Conversations is central to the exhibition, and these conversations were filmed in Senegal, Brazil, South Africa, Belgium, the United States, the UK, and the Democratic Republic of Congo between 2021 and January of 2024. This series operates under the ethos of shared authority by participants who will be sharing their memories and the institutions organizing the programs. The scope of the UC varies by location and to meet the needs of the local institution and community. The program and the oral history series were primarily organized by the Ruth Simmons Center for Slavery and Justice, for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University, in collaboration with local partners in each place these interviews were filmed. And this is an excerpt by Lorna Woods, who is a community member of Africatown, Alabama, where we filmed oral histories. And if you aren't familiar with Africatown, it is the site of the descendants of the last ship to carry enslaved Africans to the United States in 1862, the Clotilda, which was intentionally sunk in Mobile Bay in 1862. And she says, freedom may not sound like a good word when your body and soul is restricted. When those people marched with Martin Luther King, they were tired. Some people will never know what we went through. I think freedom is giving people their flowers while they can still smell the flowers. I love flowers because they are free. And I think that's a powerful way for us to think about understanding how the legacies of slavery and colonialism are both things of despair and also things of these creative practices of freedom making. And so the exhibition is organized in 6 sections. We have an introduction section where visitors will first get an understanding of the framework of the exhibition, and then we'll move into a space where they are met with visual and auditory movements and sounds and images to try to bring them into the space of this exhibition. And we then move into a section called The Roots of Inequality, which is about the history of slavery and colonialism, and then into a section called Navigating the Wake, which focuses on the stories of 9 individuals who were either enslaved or colonized from around the world, and uses their stories as a point of entry to broader experiences of global groups of people who were enslaved and colonized. And then we go to a section called The Universe of Freedom Making, which is an incredible artistic installation by an artist based in Portland, Maine, Daniel Minter. And then we move into sections, Old Practices in a New Era and Building Futures. And these sections focus on the contemporary experiences and legacies of slavery, as well as how people resisted. So section 3, I'm going to briefly talk about a story from section 3 that sort of dovetails nicely with Laura and Vijaya's talks. So in this section, we highlight the ways in which Africans and people of African descent navigated these systems of slavery and colonialism, and it privileges the lived experience and the perspectives of enslaved people. And so I'm going to talk about Jan Smysing. Jan Smysing was enslaved in the Cape Colony. So the Cape Colony was, as Laura discussed, a Dutch VOC and later a British colony. More than 60,000 enslaved laborers were brought to the region from various parts of the Indian Ocean, including India, Madagascar, Malaysia, and Mozambique. For over 200 years, enslaved people worked on the Cape alongside the indigenous Khoisan people as farm workers, seamen, and domestic laborers. The slave lodge was founded in 1679 to house these enslaved people owned by the Dutch East India Company on the Cape Colony. Jan Smysing, who was the son of an enslaved Malay woman and a Dutch official, lived and worked at the slave lodge as a schoolmaster and a healer. Healers were essential to the survival of enslaved communities. The deadly realities of slave labor and the substandard living conditions made the enslaved extremely vulnerable to a wide variety of illnesses. Enslavers provided limited, if any, treatment for these ailments. Herbalists, spiritual healers, bone setters, and midwives met the community's needs on their own terms. These practitioners used traditional African knowledge, exchanged information with indigenous peoples, and formed new networks to pass their expertise to new generations. Treating fellow enslaved people was a revolutionary act that restored bodily autonomy stripped away by enslavement. In his personal journal, which you can see here on the upper left, which survives at the Western Cape Archives, Smysing recorded remedies he used to treat, quote, company slaves. His treatments revealed the wide range of ailments afflicting the enslaved, from fever to diseases related to sexual abuse. As a healer, Jan Smeising filled a void in medical care for the enslaved population at the lodge, bringing humanity into an inhumane space. Between 1717 and 1732, he recorded a mix of content, including Ayurvedic remedies in Tamil. Like other enslaved people living on the Cape, Smeising may have spent his time off collecting herbs and roots to brew as medicine. And so we explore a little bit about the work of herbalists globally and healers and the plants that were often used by those individuals to treat various ailments. And so throughout the rest of this section, we explore a number of stories of that of a woman, a Maroon named Panza in Suriname, a woman named Mariam Diarra, who was the leader of a large slave rebellion in Senegal, a woman named Toya, who was a member of the Haitian Revolution, a woman named Rosa, who was from Berbice and who was an enslaved mother who petitioned the British government after she was beaten during late-term pregnancy and had a miscarriage. And we explore the story of William Peter Powell, who was a Black abolitionist, originally from New York and New Bedford, Massachusetts, as well as the figure of Anastasia in Brazil, Taro, who was a survivor of the Wanderer slave ship in South Carolina, as well as the Amistad rebels. And throughout the rest of the exhibition, we continue to explore how people make freedom in these unfree places and how they push for forms of restorative justice and repair. And that is it for me.
Thank you so much for that, Kate. All three papers offered insightful histories and meanings as it related to slavery and the enslaved. So I've written down a few thoughts I'd like to share, and depending on the questions that come in, we may just jump into the audience questions. Otherwise, I do have a couple of questions on my own. So all three speakers engaged in conversations about the long legacies of slavery that cover issues of memory, access to archives, or limited access to archives, resulting taboos, and the need to make such histories visible. The first was about the Dutch East Indies during the 17th century and how colonial officials engaged with and enslaved Asians and one of the critiques was we need to understand that in fact not all Africans were slaves, but neither were all slaves Africans, leaving room for a new imaginary, a new way to imagine what slaves, where slaves could come from, who slaves could be. The significance of complicating our understanding of who was or who could be a slave, and the importance of understanding the porosity of unfree slave statuses is significant and is necessary in order to understand the realities of slavery during this time. Sites of slavery are shifting organisms within themselves, as Lauren noted, and that's important because within these organisms, we see the making and breaking of relationships, the acting out of hierarchies, and the making known enslaved histories when the archive doesn't make their stories known, and having the efforts to revitalize the histories or to create anew these histories are important to our work, not just those interested in South African histories, but slavery histories in general, to continue to create global histories about slavery in this collaborative way. So as we move to the next paper, Vijaya offered an explanation of the various categories of unfree persons, highlighting the need to understand social standing, gender, and the geographical and geopolitical spaces individuals engendered while enslaved. So we need to, she suggests that we need to imagine the lifeways and the use and the value of slaves in Mauritius in order to understand their existence. There's also the suggestion that slave societies are sites of production in various ways. Not only do they produce certain items that are eventually for sale, but they produce family systems, they produce ways of knowing, ways of living, and those legacies are born from one generation to another, including the taboos that ensue when one is born into a slave family or a slave lineage. I think that this issue of taboo is one that covers many different historical regions, and those kind of comparative historical contrasts can continue to grow across scholarship. One of the final things I'd like to mention about Vijaya's talk that I found extremely important as well is how do you memorialize a legacy of slavery within lineages when the subject remains taboo? And that this issue of memorialization isn't just one that we see even in Kate's work, but it's one that we see throughout time where some societies would rather the history be buried than memorialized. So I can see that as an ongoing personal and political challenge for those of us who want to memorialize history, and rightfully so. So specifically with regards to Kate's paper, I really appreciated the title, first off, In Slavery's Wake, Making Black Freedom in the World. I think that there's a lot to be said about today's current day social political atmosphere, and how and why it was born from systems of slavery in our past here in the US. Her talk too engaged with this idea of making histories known that might not otherwise be attended to, engaging in public historical spaces as a way to educate others. But then also that the current day realities, as she notes, is a product of racial framing and the history of slavery. And it's important to think about this in terms of the violence and resistance to that slavery, and how that history lives in the blood and the daily lives of the lineage of those who are enslaved. And so finally, with regard to her talk, I think that what is really important is how this history making of slavery in these public spaces can continue to grow as individuals seek to do scholarship on them, but also as, you know, what is ever so important almost in all of our work is the funding for these initiatives. I think the same can be said for Vijaya's work. And then also with regards to Laura's work, when you're looking for access to archival materials, what other creative ways can we find these histories, and could funding in some way assist that effort as well, right? So I appreciate all three speakers. I appreciate their engagement with the topic and look forward to hearing or receiving some questions from the audience. While we're waiting for those questions, I have a question about the comparative work that we do with chattel slavery in the US, there is this, and reasonably so, this resistance to engage in these conversations about, in particular, African slavery or non-US slavery, and say this is absolutely not chattel slavery, so don't mix it up, right? There's very strong resistance in that way. But what Africanists have begun to do is start to ask, well, what are the ways that we can engage in the scholarship that is based on chattel slavery? What can we learn from these histories of chattel slavery? And how can we engage? Because although there is an automatic response to not do so, I kind of would like to know from you all, is it helpful to engage in cross-scholarly collaboration or theorizing?
Vijaya, go ahead.
For me, just a few words. The last 2-3 years, we've been going to conferences in Dakar, mainland Africa, and last year, Tanzania. And it struck me as someone from the islands, as recipients of the export of slaves from mainland Africa to our islands. And then we had, of course, Western scholars, Europe from the US. And it struck me how different our perspectives are. African academics from the mainland see slavery in a different way. They exported slaves. In Mauritius and Réunion and Madagascar, we are the recipients. So the way you study slavery, the way you see slavery, when you have descendants in the country, whereas on the mainland, in some countries there are descendants, but in others they're not. I mean, there was no. So I think the way you study slavery is very different. You study the slave trade, you study discrimination and racism, depending on your geographical location, whether you're in the colonizing country in UK or France or whatever, or in mainland Africa, you don't see slavery in the same way as a descendant, a country with descendants see slavery or study slavery. This is my personal, view. For the last 20, 30 years, we've been looking at slavery.
Thank you. Laura?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Vijaya is saying. And I also think there are ways that we can begin to unpack. I'm just trying to think of the right word, complicate, but really unpack in a way that isn't about rigid sociological definitions of what's slavery. And I think, Robin, some of the adamancy and tensions that you mentioned between conflating slavery, particularly in West Africa, regions that were sources of sending slaves into the Atlantic slave trade, and trying to differentiate local enslavement there from the practices of chattel slavery into the Atlantic. Some of that I read as responses to race-based justifications of slavery that said, well, it's really okay that Africans were enslaved in these olden times because Africans enslaved each other. So what's the problem if some Europeans also took these already enslaved bodies and used them too, right? So there a definite push from Africanist and Afrocentric perspective to say, hang on, these are different things. And the ways in which those people were treated on the continent or in the Atlantic system were very different. So let's separate that out. And I don't, as a white scholar based in North America, there's ways in which I want to tread really carefully into, who gets to say what. I'm not policing that. But there's a rationale for that division. I'm not sure that's the most important political debate we can be having right now, as both Vijaya's and Kate's work is showing us, and that now may be a larger political and historical moment in which we can say, let's go back and take a really big basket of subordinated, enslaved experiences of laborers, and not necessarily try and like put people on a continuum or experiences and say, you know, A, B, C, here's where we draw lines, but instead to think in a more holistic way. Societies everywhere made choices about where their labor and laborers came from and about how to treat laborers. And let's look at the historical specificity without presuming a particular outcome. Atlantic slavery, Indian Ocean slavery, debt peonage, whatever that is.
Thank you so much. I will go to a question from online. The question is, why is the narrative and history of slavery in the Indian Ocean overshadowed by this transatlantic slave trade? Is it merely the geography?
Vijaya, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I suppose. I think it's a question of funding research, and also very much funding research, and also the fact that in our countries, you still have structures of, as Tut said in his paper, structures of domination that still exist. So people are not willing to talk about slavery openly. When I first started my research very long ago in the 1980s, I went to the village of Le Monde, which is has the iconic mountain where Maroons had lived, and I started asking questions to elderly men and women, and they said, "No, we are not going to talk about slavery at all. The bourgeois, their employer, will be angry." And the bourgeois employer happened to be also Franco of French origin. So there was that fear until the 1980s, which is not the case in the US, because I think in the US you speak more openly and frankly to each other, which is not the case in our part of the world.
I'd like to add to that, if I can, that when I see a predominance of Atlantic perspectives, that comes from my situation trained in North America and Western Europe, and having grown up in the US in a society that is the recipient or has a legacy of slavery in the Atlantic. So that's what we were taught in school. That was my baseline for beginning to do more inquiry. And Vijaya already brought up the differences in how scholarship looks depending on who's doing it and where it's done. If we had some giant scale and we could put all the books and articles that are written about Atlantic slavery, or written about slavery in general in any language, and we had an Atlantic slavery basket and a Mediterranean basket and an Indian Ocean basket, the Indian Ocean basket would be lighter. And part of that is about who has funding to do work. There's just a lot more scholars in the US. And many more of us have access to research funding than scholars based in other parts of the world, particularly economically emerging countries in the Indian Ocean. So again, Vijaya is better positioned to talk about this than I am. In those countries, is it often not the greatest priority to fund any historical research on the 17th, 18th, or 19th century? Money is going to go someplace else. And it's a legacy of exactly the kinds of inequalities that Kate's presentation brings up.
Thank you so much. We have a general question, and perhaps Kate would like to answer this one at the start. The question is about what led you to your particular area of study. What was your motivation?
well, my motivation, what is actually rooted in some work I did as a young child at this point, about 20 years ago, on a community in Maine, where I am from, called Malaga Island, which was a mixed race fishing community that was forcibly evicted by the state of Maine in 1912. And many of the community members were institutionalized and forcibly sterilized as part of eugenic policies. And so there's a long history of the descendant community advocating for that. And so I did archaeology on that island, and it really, I had a background as a young person, 16 years old, doing Amnesty International and a lot of protesting myself. And so social justice, racial justice was really important to me. And this seemed like a way that I could, focus my academic career. And so for me, when I got to Howard University, it really focused my energy on understanding, my role as a white scholar, and my, what I can and should study, and how I should position myself in this field, studying this history. And was lucky enough in 2014 to get a job at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and sort of eventually found my way after my PhD into the position that I am lucky enough now to have as a historian of global slavery at the museum. So
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to the next question to make sure that we get it in. Thank you for such a rich panel discussion. Speaking of legacies of slavery, what continues to be the tensions among descendants of enslaved and indentured peoples in some of the locations of your study, as might be observed, say, in Guyana? So, Vijaya, this might be for you, if it's helpful.
I'm not really a specialist of the Caribbean, but I know in Mauritius, Réunion, was in the Indian Ocean, perhaps South Africa, there was massive immigration of indentured laborers from India after abolition of slavery to have additional labor for the sugar plantations, which was expanding. So yes, there were tensions at that time. Among descendants, there are tensions. It's more political competition for space. There's also cultural competition. If one has a museum, the other must have a museum. But from what I've heard from the Caribbean, the tensions in this part of the world don't seem to be as, I can't think of the word, don't seem to be as, the situation doesn't seem to be as tense. Because there's been a very strong move by governments to prevent, physical violence and what you see in some parts of the Caribbean. So there's been really a move to not silence, but how to balance the competition and try and make everybody happy. It's not a very scientific analysis, I'm sorry, but it's just a personal view.
No, it's helpful. Thank you. We have another question. Do enslaved pasts look different when seen from the perspective or meta-narrative of freedom? Is the Atlantic world different from the Indian Ocean world in this respect? Is this different between scholars and the public?
well, I can speak from the perspective of the work that we're doing within Slavery's Wake, which I think very much, gets to some of this question. And I do think that there is, they can look different because you are, particularly by focusing on freedom making and the ways in which people persisted despite all of these conditions, despite the dehumanization and the violence, and the ongoing ways that people have been subject to systemic racism and discrimination and colonialism and things like that. I think when you look through the lens at these histories, through the lens of also this resistance and creative practices of freedom making, you begin to see a fuller picture of the agency of the individual who was enslaved or colonized, and get to understand a bit more about their experience past the violence and the victimization narrative, which is obviously incredibly important to understand these conditions and the dehumanization, the attempts at dehumanization that slavery tried to impose upon people as a system, but finding these methods of resistance and these freedom-making narratives that are always entangled with these experiences is, I think, really important for people in the present day to kind of connect with these historical pasts and these historical people. And you understand these people as full individuals with full lives, I think, in a much deeper way when you examine freedom as well.
Thank you so much for that. It helps enlighten our idea between the two experiences. Any others for that particular question? If not, any last comments before we close?
Sorry, Robin, I was a little slow. I would like to say something briefly.
Sure.
And in some ways, I feel like perhaps Grant was teeing that question up for a South African response, because the local interest in, and my sense as an outsider, acceptance in some communities in South Africa of potentially being descended from slaves, or being largely socially, like having a slave lineage within a larger social group. Those conversations are more open, and people are more interested in having them in a post-1994 South Africa than a pre-94 South Africa. So a sense of, for however complicated present day South Africa is in terms of race-based freedoms, it is not a panacea place, but the absence of a particular kind of race-based oppression has changed the conversation.
Thank you so much to all three of our speakers. We appreciate Stanford's Global Studies team for organizing this. We also appreciate the attendance of all of those who joined us via Zoom, and we look forward to seeing all of you at our next event. Thank you very much.